a non-school team. And it was our last game. It was a raw, cold, gray day. And the game began at about 11 o'clock. We had to take the subway up to the park where the game was played. And so at the end of the game, there was a diner across the street from the park. And we thought, go to the diner and get some coffee, some hot chocolate or something. Well, we go in the diner, and there was no TV in those days. The radio was on, and this very somber voice was talking about Pearl Harbor. And that's when we first heard that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And then, of course, we didn't know. And the girl I was dating, her brother was over there. He was in the Navy, and his ship was at Pearl Harbor. So right away, you start worrying about the war, and then you start worrying about the people involved. And the wind-up eventually is that his ship was not at Pearl Harbor, it was out at maneuvers. So they missed the bombing. So we looked at each other on the subway going back home, and maybe a half a dozen of the fellas said, let's go down tomorrow and enlist, because it was Sunday, but Monday we'd go down. So we went down to Navy recruiting. The Navy was getting all the attention because that's where they bombed Army air bases, but Pearl Harbor was getting the attention. So we went down to the Navy, probably still in 90 Church Street, New York, was the Navy recruiting, in the area where the World Trade Building was. And they only took 2 of us. I was rejected because of my eyes. Another fellow had overbite, they rejected him. Every minute thing, because they were still on peacetime recruiting, where they didn't want every guy who, depression, no job, let's join the service. So they were really selective. So luckily, I guess, I worked in the area. So I guess every lunch hour, every time after, I'd go to a recruiting office. And I went to the Marines, and the guy was right out of the book Marine. Not a wasted ounce on him. You could cut butter with the creases in his uniform. He looked like Sam Elliott, the movie actor, always plays a Western. And a big application for the Marines. And he looks it over, and he says, well, yeah, you're good, you're here. And then he gets down about a third, and it says glasses. So I lied, and I said, I wear glasses for reading. I really need them all the time. I wear glasses for reading. So he holds up the application. He says, here, son, read this. Nice try, son. It's the first time I was ever called son by somebody. He says, nice try, son. And he rips it up. So that was the end of my career in the Marines. But I kept going back to Navy and kept going back to the Army. And the Navy kept saying no. And the Army hesitated each time. You finish up seeing a row of doctors and whatnot, and this one doctor reads everything, and he has about 8 rubber stamps. And you keep looking at that accepted stamp, and what stamp is going to rejected. And so finally, after 3 months, in March 9th, he picked up the accepted, but for limited service. So I went in as 1B, which meant I couldn't go to combat. And that's how I wound up in the Medical Corps. And I spent 45 months with the Medical Corps, the Army Medical Corps. This is out in Camp Upton, Long Island, where we were inducted. And that's where Irving Berlin in World War I wrote, "Oh, how I hate to get up in the morning." So the camp was a crazy name, an Indian name, Yaphank, Camp Yaphank. And from there, they sent a whole trainload of us. We got on a train, maybe after about a week at Yaphank, and wound up at Fort Bragg in the 66th General Hospital. The Army has a whole string of aid stations, evacuation hospitals. You get hit in on the front, and they just keep sending you back further and further till you hit a place where they can, help you the best. And the largest and major Army hospitals are the named general hospitals, like Walter Reed. That's their general hospitals. And overseas, the general hospitals are numbered. They don't have a name, they're numbered. and we wound up with the 65th General Hospital, and we were trained to run a hospital. And we were called the Duke unit because all the doctors and nurses came from Duke University. So we were the Duke unit. And I guess I tested well. The first thing they do at Yaphank, give you a uniform and take your civilian clothes that you went there with, and then you take a series of tests. And I guess I did pretty well on the test because the next day my name comes over. They had loudspeakers on the telephone poles to go to building 6B or something. And some guy, hey, how'd you like to be a pilot? I said, oh boy, pilot, the glory, the glamour. He says, because I was 135 pounds, I fit into a fighter cockpit nicely. And I'm saying to myself, gee, the fighter pilot's life expectancy is 2.5 missions. At that time, they were getting the hell shot out of them. 2.5 missions. I said, maybe. I think I bet, let nature take its course. They want me in the medics. I said, no, you better look at that. And sure enough, my eyes again. He said, I'm sorry. So I missed being a pilot. But the test carried through because when we got to Bragg, I guess they looked at it again. What do we do with these guys? Who goes to the wards, who goes to pharmacy, who goes to the operating room? And they put me on a thing called central supply, which you got the list from the operating room like the afternoon before, and you set up different trays for different operations. So your job was sterilizing all the instruments, and then appendicitis, XYZ, broken arm, LBM, whatever. And that's what I was destined for. And the Army has, and businesses have it too, a table of organization. So many lieutenants, so many sergeants, so many this. And they looked at the table. The old guys in the slop chute who drinking beer and talking about things and how they can make life better for themselves and the hell with the other guy. So they finally hit central supply. They say, gee, that's 5 stripes. Boy, eventually you become a tech sergeant. You only get 6 stripes, but that job called for 5. And they said, who's there? And he said, I don't know, this 19-year-old kid Ryder. Get about it. So they pulled me out, and the next thing you know, I'm carrying bedpans. So that was the beginning of my war with the Army. If they want to play games, I'm going to play games. So I'm on the ward, and I don't show up. I go to the service club every day, and nothing happens. So finally, after about a month of goofing off, they called me in and give me hell because the sergeant who checked the wards said he hit my ward. Said, no, Ryder isn't here again today. But nothing happened. So to wind up, I find out later he recognized my name. Jim Ryder, I know a Jim Ryder. My father's name is Jim Ryder. And this guy worked with my father. So he says, I wonder if that's the same Jim Ryder. So he never turned me in because he knew my father and he thought I was my father's son. So I got away with it. But then they called for a small group to be taken out of the outfit and sent up to Camp Kilman, New Jersey to start a new outfit. So they took all the screw-ups and said, look, let's get rid of these guys. So they took all the guys that signed up for OCS. They said, look, we're going to lose them anyway they go to officer candidate school, and so they have to process all the papers out. They said, look, we're going to have to process these guys anyway, so get rid of them. And then we still need 5 or 6 more guys, get rid of the screw-ups. So that's how I wound up getting out of the general hospital and going to this small outfit up to Camp Kilman, New Jersey. But again, I was 35 minutes from home, 35 miles from home, New York City. And so what it was called a 6th Platoon Separate Ship Hospital. And we didn't know what for, but there we were. And they gave us 6 officers, 5 MDs and 1 doctor, dental surgeon. And then we wind up on a ship in Staten Island, a troop transport, the SS Monterey, which was a Matson liner that used to play Hawaiian music and sail between San Francisco and Hawaii and Aloha Oi. And it's, oh boy, the Monterey, but it's painted gray. And we get on that, and I guess they carry about 6,000 troops on it. And we take off by ourselves. This was 1942, 1943. This was the October, November of 42. And we didn't know it, but it was the first invasion of the war in the Atlantic, Operation Torch, which was French North Africa, Casablanca, Iran, those around the Mediterranean, around to the Atlantic coast. We didn't know that. But we sailed alone, not in a convoy, because the transports could outrun the submarines. But the submarines were murdering. They killed, they sunk tons and tons of ships and supplies, because we were supplying Britain with food and ammunition and everything they needed for the war, and the submarines were wrecking the hell out of us. They would travel in packs. They're called wolf packs, and there were sunken ships right off the coast here that the subs got. And so we crossed it alone, and then we didn't know where we were. We were just sailing back, because you could always tell on a ship the motion of you could feel the ship beating, like you can feel your heart beating. You felt the heart of the ship beating. And it was slow, but we kept moving. And what it was, there was an invasion going on, which we didn't know about, the invasion of French North Africa. And we were off Casablanca with backup troops. If they were needed, they go in. But the invasion went very easily. South Carolina, Mark Clark, who was at the Citadel for a while, he was the general who arranged the whole thing. And then we couldn't get into the harbor because Casablanca is a man-made harbor. And in the battle, they sank the ships. And so you couldn't get to the piers because ships were sunk. And there was a brand new French battleship at Casablanca at the time, the Jean Bart. And they scuttled that so we wouldn't get a hold of it. But scuttling, it settled on the mud, but the guns could still fire. So the guns of the Jean Bart were raising hell. They were firing way up to another beach where they were, Port Leote, where they were landing. And so we kept sailing back and forth because we couldn't get in. There was no place to tie the ship up and get off of it. Because somebody decided, well, the invasion went well, but we're not letting these guys go back home. We're over there. They'll find something for us to do. They let the troops off. They said, well, what do we do with that ship's platoon? Take them off. We'll find something for them to do. But so they cut the tops off of the sunken ships. It's amazing what they do. They cut the tops off the sunken ship and use that for a dock. So you'd walk off your ship across the top of this sunken ship. They might cut it off at the main deck or something, and you'd land. And then in Casablanca, there were 10 ship platoons. I guess 3 of them landed up in the Mediterranean, Algeria, and 7 landed along the Moroccan coast. And we were on malaria control. We'd go out in the swamps and the ponds, and they didn't have plastic in those days, so you had these rubber waders that came up to your chest, and they were hotter than hell. And you're out there with this thing on your back spraying oil on the ponds and whatnot to control mosquitoes. We finally hired natives to do the job, and we just drove them out to the places where they had to work. We ran a medical supply warehouse, and I always remember one United States Pharmacopedia number, USP 15,000. It was Jack Daniels' black label used for medicinal purposes. And we had a rush on USP 15,000. All these officers would come in, young man. They didn't want cough syrup. They didn't want iodine. They wanted USP 15,000. So we could never hold on to the bourbon. That was another job we had there. We had a guard a hospital. The hospital was right in the middle of town, and the natives could just put their hands underneath the tents that were lining the street and grab maybe a barracks bag, maybe a blanket, maybe a pair of shoes. So we had to walk around the hospital. And since we were medics, we couldn't have weapons. So we had a tent peg about that big, and that was used to guard the hospital. They had us unloading ships. We didn't unload them. They had us down on the docks, and they're taking the stuff off the ships. And on the ground of the pier, there were these 500-pound bombs for the bombers. So me, I have no mechanical skills at all. They give me a forklift and say, you pick up these bombs, these 500-pound bombs, and then drive a few feet with the fork and slowly lower it into a boxcar, the old 40 and 8s from World War I. And so here with this forklift, and here are these bombs, and I get the hooks under them and then tilt it back, and then drive over to the train and get it in. And one of them rolls off. I released it. The dopey reaction, I put my hands to my ears as this bomb fell on the ground. But it wasn't fused, so it didn't go off. And they would take the train up to Aces, I guess, and and load the bombs. And then all of a sudden, they sent us back to the States. After 9 months in Casablanca, they said, you guys are going back to the States. And sitting in the harbor, because we were on a hill overlooking Casablanca Harbor, there's this beautiful ship, the SS America, our biggest and fastest. I think it set the speed record for crossing the Atlantic. And they said, you're going back on that. You take them sick and wounded back, because for these transports to carry sick and wounded, they didn't have any medics on board, because they were basically for transporting troops. And so they needed medics on board to take care, because to take them back sick and wounded Americans, sick and wounded German prisoners, sick and wounded Italian prisoners, French air cadets, and occasional other people. And so we got on board, and the ship was sealed because they were afraid the Germans or the Italians would throw messages out the portholes, and for the submarines to pick up. And the ships, there were no air conditioning in those days, and they would suck air in from these big funnels on the decks, and the ship smelled because these prisoners and patients all had bandages that might have been on for a week or 10 days, and they were rotting away. And so our first sergeant was an Italian American, and he sort of commiserated with the Italian prisoners who were pretty badly banged up. And so he asked if we could get them on deck so they can get some fresh air, because down where they were, we had everything sealed up. And so we finally got one Italian guy who had arms, was carrying a guy who didn't have any legs, and we got a bunch of them up, and our job was to guard them. Now, where they were going to go in the middle of the ocean, I don't know, but we were supposed to go. We volunteered, we'd guard them, because otherwise they wouldn't let them go up there. And up above, looking down in this area where the Italians were the French cadets going to the United States to learn to fly. And the world loves the French, and the Italians, the world's worst. We're lovers. They would tell us we're lovers, we're not fighters or anything, because they didn't want to be known as Mussolini's bad guys. And they always say, King's Army, King's Army. I guess they had two armies. Mussolini had one, and the king had one. They're all King's Army. All of a sudden, Mussolini didn't have an army. Everybody's King's Army. And here's these poor Italians that look up and they see the Frenchmen. They go, and they spit up. So there was somebody even lower than these beat-up Italians in the minds of the Italians. So one day you could feel the ship, the engines slowing. You could feel it on your feet all the time. And it was a beautiful June day. We landed in November of 42. Now this is June of 43. And you feel the motion of the ship, and beautiful morning, maybe 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, and we pull into this beautiful harbor. Boston. Big signs, Boston Fish Market, Boston Steel, Boston, 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 Boston Inquirer, you know. And we had, the German troops were the best they had, the Africa Corps, Rommel's Africa Corps. And they were prisoners of war, and they were up on deck. And all these big blonde supermen, you know, they're all up on deck. And they're looking out, and they said, Boston, Boston. I said, this isn't Boston. Some of them spoke English. I said, this isn't Boston. I said, what does it say there? Boston Fish Market, Boston Steel, Boston Inquirer. What does it say there? He says, no. The German army's conquered all of Canada, and it's as far west in America as Chicago. You know, Hitler's propaganda. I said, well, you'll be here a while. You'll learn differently. But they were crying. The German Africa Corps, they were crying when they realized that the propaganda they had was baloney. And you know, really surprised to see the best guys the Germans had crying. And then they sent us back to, they took us off the ship, and we went back to Camp Kilmer again, 35 miles from New York City. And then Kilmer, they sent us down to, that after maybe a month or two, 2 months, they sent us down to a wartime camp called Patrick Henry. It was around Newport News, Virginia. And again, we were back on a ship going over, this time it was a Liberty ship. Liberty ships, they made thousands of them. They were like the 18-wheelers of World War II, except they were ships. They carried everything over. They only went about 12 knots an hour. I think they made one every 24 hours. They were turning out these ships down at Brunswick, Georgia, and other places. And we went on a Liberty ship in a convoy that time. I think the Germans got one ship in the convoy because we saw way over. It might have been 50 or 60 ships spread all over the ocean, and one you could see, you know, smoke and whatnot. So the Germans got one of them. And this time we went through Gibraltar, so we knew we were in the Mediterranean now. And way, way up is a little tiny airplane. And it was a German spotter plane watching the ships coming through Gibraltar, and then, you know, letting the Germans know that. And so he followed our convoy, and we wound up in this town called Bizerti in Tunisia. And that night, they bombed the hell out of us because this guy reported that the convoy wound up in Bizerti, and they bombed the hell out of us. But they sank a couple of ships, but they didn't come near us. And then we wound up a couple of miles up the road in the 33rd General Hospital. See, that's a numbered General Hospital, and you find them overseas. They were handling sick and wounded from the fighting in Sicily and the fighting in Italy. They conquered Sicily, and now they were fighting in southern Italy. So mostly we did outside work, pouring concrete, which when it dried, they put up big hospital tents that could fit about 30 to 40 beds in it. And we just did general work around there. And we were eating out of cans. That was one thing about overseas in the beginning. You were eating out of something that called K-rations that looked like a Cracker Jack box, and they had a little tin of like sauce-pot meat, and they had some biscuits and whatnot, 3 cigarettes, and powder to make some kind of a drink. And we're eating a lot of that. And down the road on the harbor, the Navy had a huge base. And the Navy had refrigerated ships, and the Navy ate well. And so I said, well, you go down there, and if you ask them, they'll feed you. So we said, well, gee, that'd be better than that darn K-ration. Let's go down to the Navy. So one lunch hour, we get a chance to go down. It's about a mile down. We walk in this huge building, and this officer is at the doorway. He looked, boy, he had the perfect uniform, tailor-made uniform, shiny brass. He looked great. And he says, can I help you fellas? I think he was lieutenant. Yes, lieutenant. We heard that, you'd give us some food if we arrived and you had food left over. And of course, the Navy always gives the Army the business, and he's asking us dopey questions. And, the Army is referred to as doggies, the Marines are jarhead Marines, the Navy is swabbies. Everybody had a sort of a negative nickname. And he's kidding us doggies before he would let us eat. We had to pay with his needling to get a meal. So finally, I keep looking at the guy. Douglas Fairbanks Jr., the actor, that's who it was. And he looked Hollywood, that uniform, that's who it was. Just a regular nice guy. I hear later on he went into intelligence. He was not sharp, but here he was running this mess hall. So finally we get through with the banter and he turns down and, "Hey, give these doggies something to eat." He had to get the doggie. There's, the distinguished Douglas Fairbanks. So the doggies got something to eat. And then bang, the next thing you know, we're going back to Casablanca. This time they put us on the boxcars, those 40 and 8s, and we took the train through the top of North Africa, Algiers, and on back to Casablanca. And we're going to take more sick and wounded back. And this time it was on an English ship, the HMS Andes. And we got on this English ship with American sick and wounded. And the British were giving us a bad time because they had been in the war since 1939. We got in 1941, December. And these guys hadn't been home like in 3 years because the ship was all over the Pacific. The ship was just nonstop going someplace. And they said, give these heroes these heroes of 6 months, because that's about all, we had been in the darn thing. And so we had a pretty bad time on that English ship. And that came into, the Newport News. We were then again sent back to Camp Kilmer. And there we joined they were making a new outfit, the 200th Hospital Ship Complement. And we were the nucleus because we had been in the Army maybe by that time 2 years and had been overseas for 2 times. And so we had the experience, and we were the core group for this new outfit. And the windup was, so again, now we're back in the States for a year and a half. Well, these, the guys go overseas, they're over there for 1 or 2 years, but we were back, we were gone no longer than 9 months. And now we're back in the States for about a year and a half, training again for hospital duty. And the windup was we were getting our own ship, the biggest hospital ship. They were converting a ship up in Boston. And we were getting the United States Army hospital ship, Lewis A. Milne. I think it had about 900 beds. If you go on the internet and look for World War II hospital ships, Milne is featured. And so it was great. So they ship us up to another wartime camp, Miles Standish, in Brockton, Massachusetts. And we wait for the ship, which was being converted in the Navy, in Bethlehem Steel, I think I was, in Boston Harbor. And in March of '45, we got on the ship, and they trial ran it for a couple of times. And then the next thing you know, we're going to England to pick up sick and wounded. And we made about 4 or 5 trips like that. Charleston, South Carolina, became the main port for hospital ships. It's a small harbor, so it didn't, clutter up with the freighters and the Navy. So Charleston became the place for the hospital ships to come in and unload. And they sent us down there from Utica, New York. We're up at Rhodes named General Hospital working. And they sent us from Rhodes down to, again, a temporary camp, the Charleston Army Base, I guess it was called. And from the base, we would go down and unload ships. I had a job driving an ambulance to, I think, Roper, I think, was the Army hospital at the time. And so we spent time down in Charleston for about 3 or 4 months. And then they sent us up to Camp Miles Standish, another temporary one in Brockton, Massachusetts, and we waited for the ship. And now the war was over in Europe in April of '45, and so there's no more wounded over there. And I guess the sick, they were either going on a hospital ship or flying them back because they didn't need the planes for wartime duty. And so we tied up at Staten Island, New York. The ship needed some repairs, and that's when the Japanese quit. The day we tied up in August of '45, the Japanese quit. And so they repaired the ship maybe in 2 weeks' time. And again, I lived in New York City, so I was home every time. And then they sent us to the Pacific. And it was interesting to me to go through the Panama Canal and land in Honolulu. And in Honolulu, we went to the Philippines and picked up a load of sick and wounded. And one of the sick was a one-star general who had nasal pharyngitis. So he was going back to the States sick with nasal pharyngitis. And the everyday term for nasal pharyngitis is the common cold. But since he was a general, he got back home earlier on the ship because he had nasal pharyngitis. And but we got back to Los Angeles area, I think, Long Beach, California, and I got off. I was done. My points were up, and I was discharged in California, and it was Christmas time, so and you couldn't get out of California because everybody was getting discharged, and there was riots down at the railroad station. They had MPs all over the railroad station because people wanted to get on a train and go home. It was Christmas. And we heard that the train next stop is Riverside, California. So we went down there, and the train stops, and who gets off every platform but MPs, so you couldn't sneak on the train. So apparently the guys down in front of the train started a fight, and the only MPs ran down there to break up the fight, and we just walked on the train. And so, but there was no place to sit or stand or sleep, so I got off the train in Gallup, New Mexico, and got a motel room. And because then I heard the next train would be like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So I get back to the station about 3 o'clock, and a train pulls in. I said, oh, that's not. It was a troop train taking guys back to the interior of the United States. And a bunch of them come running off and say, hey, where's there a liquor store? Where's the liquor store? I said, well, about a block down. So they come back and said, thanks a lot. And they all loaded with booze. And they said, where you guys? Come on a train with us. They won't know. So I got on that train with the troop train and wound up in Chicago. And I had relatives in South Bend, Indiana, which was fairly close to Chicago. So I visited them, and then I got back home, and that was it. I bummed around for a year and a half. I couldn't find a job I liked. And I finally decided to go to college. But I had always contributed at home, helping, because it was during the Depression, contributing some money that I earned. So I asked my parents that, they wouldn't get any money if I was going to school on the bill. And I wound up at Ball State. When I got out there, it said Ball State. Teachers College. I said, oh, God, I don't want to be a teacher. And I called a buddy of mine up that the Navy had sent to Yale. I said, hey, I'm not a teacher. He says, don't worry, the first year of college is the same. Can you crack a book? Can you work in the library? Can you work with these kids? Because, the incoming class was 18. I was going in at age 25. And it was the best mistake I ever made, because I spent 31 years in the classroom teaching when I got out, and I just enjoyed every day of it. When I first came down here and I passed that old school in Murrells Inlet, I started crying and said, I should be there. That's how much I enjoyed it. So I have no complaints. The troops, not everybody's fighting, you know. People delivering mail, people driving trucks, people delivering food, people repairing equipment, replacing equipment. How many people must be engaged in logistics of getting those planes to that place at that time, you know? 26 years in Murrells Inlet. Came down here to play golf. My legs went bad, so I can't play golf. And I like to travel. I can't travel. But 86 years old. People say I don't look 86, but I said, well, my mother lived to be 100, so I guess I have her genes. And the good thing is I have my marbles. I'm not, you know, vegetating someplace. And that's it.
Do you have family?
No, I never married. The thing I think that hit me the most was we knew the war was, we knew we were going to win. There was never any doubt. From day one, you know, we just knew we were going to win. So you didn't worry about that. I think the thing that hit me, we were coming back from England on the hospital ship in April, first trip, I guess, and Roosevelt died. That got us. That really, you know, because Roosevelt, what, he went in 1932, had been president, what, 3 or 4, and that got us, because, you know, Roosevelt was everything. You know, he was that kind of a man. That got us. And when the Germans quit, when you expected it. When the Japanese quit, you expected it. And we were in Staten Island, and they got off the ship. They let most of us go home, but one of the troop transports, the Wakefield, caught fire. It was kind of so from then on, they had to have a fire watch, and when they were welding, somebody had to stand there with fire extinguishers. And so we had to keep some of the people on the ship for fire watch. And but I was able to go home, and so we had to leave the ship and then get down to the Staten Island ferry and cross New York Harbor. And an old ice truck picks us up, like a pickup truck with a frame back. You know, it's an old Italian guy from Italy, and he's proud. He's got these American soldiers in the car, and he's got the horn blowing all the way from the ship to the ferry boat. I always remember that ride with this guy going bananas with the war over, and he has these heroes in the back who never did anything more than unwrap a Band-Aid or something. But no, we just knew we were going to win. Well, they were doctors primarily. So, like on this ship, we might have had 25 doctors, 40 some odd nurses, and maybe 3 officers that weren't doctors. A supply officer, a detachment officer, and a company officer. And it never really, I don't know, we're sort of like a team. It was sort of a, you respected their rank and their position, but there was never any. One officer was trying to date a nurse, and the nurse kept turning him down. She was dating the first sergeant that was on the QT, because he was an enlisted man, she was an officer. But she was seeing the first sergeant. And so this officer who wanted to date her asked her for a date, and she says, no, she's occupied. And he says, yeah, I understand you're dating an enlisted man. If he was an enlisted man, it means he's not smart enough to be an officer. Why don't you date an officer? And she said, well, my brother happens to be in the infantry, and he's an enlisted man, and I have no regard for your comments. And she told the sergeant, and he told everybody. So all over the ship, like I would get on the PA. I was the voice of the colonel. The colonel had a problem with the PA, so I was his voice. He was the commanding officer. This is Colonel Amato. I want all you stupid people to pay attention. Every other word on the ship was stupid. You'd be down one end of the deck, you see him, hey, stupid! The guys were running the newspaper quoting, you could tell a stupid man by the length of his beard, Aristotle. They were making up every day. Guess who the first guy off the ship bagging baggage? Lieutenant Johns. Since that initial, when they took me out of that job, I just soured. The initial job with that Central Supply. I said, oh, this is the game. Because I was a 19-year-old dopey kid. And those years, 19 was, not today's 19. And I was a nice guy, an honest guy, try to, do what I could. But that immediately soured me. It just turned me around. And I'm like that. I turn like this. I can, really care for somebody, and if they mess up, chop. No gradual, it's just stopped. So it just turned me off. But I like is that, never really had it bad. 4 years, never really had it bad. And, saw a lot of the world. I had some pictures in that book there. Bizerti was very near Carthage, and I'm a history guy, and Hannibal and his elephants, fighting the Romans, and there's Carthage right there. With the great armies of the world, the British Eighth Army, Montgomery and the Desert Rats, they were right there. The prisoners we had were the Africa Corps, Rommel's Africa Corps. Germany's best. Well, I think it was a growing up experience because, as I said, as a 19-year-old, just a young kid, I think, well, when you got to college, they told you that your presence in the classroom will be good for the 18-year-olds. And it made you realize that, hey, I'm a different person now. I'm 5 years older or whatever it was. And it kind of helped you grow into what I think, Brokaw was right with the greatest generation. You just felt without, like a friend of mine, a guy who knows me for 40 years, he said, you never talk about the war. I said, it was just a job I had to do, that day. You don't talk about, the kid you gave a lousy report card to 48, 30 years ago. The same thing, with the war. It was just a job you had to do. But it was a maturation period. Went from a runny-nosed kid to an adult, facing a classroom. So I wouldn't go back. I hated the Army. I didn't like people over you who were dumber than you. We were pouring concrete up a hill, and boy, pushing a wheelbarrow full of cement up a hill wasn't much fun. And we had this sergeant pushing us from this other outfit. Come on, man, snap. I can't say the word. Come on, man, snap. Getting us up the hill. This wheelbarrow is telling us to snap something. Come on, man, snap. That's what I didn't like about the Army. Is lesser people being in a commanding role.